Welcome to The Thing About Witch Hunts. I'm Josh Hutchinson.
I'm Sarah Jack. In today's episode, we discuss the classic children's novel, The Witch of Blackbird Pond, with Gillie Johnson and Martha Smart of Connecticut's Wethersfield Historical Society.
Wethersfield, Connecticut is the setting of this classic and enduringly popular work of historical fiction, and also a community where real witchcraft accusations were made during the Connecticut witch trials.
Author Elizabeth George Speare's beloved 1958 novel, The Witch of Blackbird Pond, has made 17th century Wethersfield a lasting part of American literary heritage, introducing generations of readers to colonial Connecticut life.
The town's actual history includes the real 1669 witch trial of Katherine Harrison, a widow whose case revealed the dangers faced by independent women at that time.
While Connecticut's witch trials predate Salem's more famous persecution, they remain a lesser-known but significant chapter in the state's history.
Let's welcome Gillie and Martha to the show and hear what they are doing to highlight the lesser-known history of Wethersfield.
Welcome to the Thing About Witch Hunts podcast, Gillie Johnson and Martha Smart. Please tell us about yourselves and what you do for the Wethersfield Historical Society.
Hello, I'm Gillie Johnson. I am the museum educator here at Wethersfield Historical Society. So that means I'm in charge of field trips that happen here in Wethersfield to our museum building. We have a number of students every year from not only Wethersfield, but also other towns who come to learn more about colonial history, the American Revolution, or other aspects of Wethersfield history. And as you can imagine, the Witch of Blackbird Pond is always popular.
Especially now.
Yes, around in the fall. Yes.
We like to think of ourselves, and we have become in some way Salem light or Salem on the cheap, because a lot of people come here rather than going to Salem, Massachusetts.
Because if you're in Connecticut, it's less costly to have the bus drive to Salem than to Wethersfield.
So I'm Martha Smart. I am the research and reference librarian here, as well as doing library duties. I answer a lot of questions about Connecticut history and genealogy. And my background is not colonial American history, but European history of the 18th century, which feeds in nicely to what we are doing here. And we try to answer all questions that we get. We do answer all questions that we get. And sometimes it deals with going up to the town and searching land records and genealogy records that we have here. And hopefully we learn something too in our research.
What would you like for people to know about Wethersfield and the Historical Society?
So Wethersfield is one of Connecticut's oldest towns. People in Wethersfield will tell you that we are the oldest town in Connecticut, but people in Windsor will disagree with that statement. In our museum building, we have a box from the 1930s that Windsor sent to Wethersfield. And on the box, it says, "To Old Wethersfield from older Windsor." So there's been a long rivalry between Wethersfield and Windsor over who's actually older.
The thing is, it's kind of a ridiculous argument, because within just a couple of years, Hartford, Wethersfield, and Windsor were established as the Connecticut colony. And one of my chief concerns is when people arrive or when they come in, they know nothing about the religious background of the Puritans, who these people were and what they believed in and how they came to be here. And I think that's basic to understanding Wethersfield's history. So we do as much educating here and answering research questions as we do spreading the word about Wethersfield.
So that's one of the big things at Wethersfield Historical Society, educating people. And part of our mission is to serve and promote Wethersfield history to inspire people today and tomorrow. And we believe in sharing all of Wethersfield's history, not just the history of white people who lived here in Wethersfield, everybody. So that's very important to us.
Yeah, the forgotten people. Because there was quite a history of slavery here. And there's quite a bit of Native American history here that nobody seems to emphasize. So we try to do the whole history.
Yes.
Because that's complete. That's the true picture. Not just that you had some ancestor. There could have been a gentry in England who came over here and did marvelous things. Not always true. The people that were here not because they were here originally, and other people were not here because they wanted to be here, because they were seized and brought here as slaves.
History is complicated, and we try and share that with people, both the good and the bad.
Yeah, American history is especially complicated. And now there seems to be a pushback about burying it again. So we try not to let that happen. That's our mission. It's one of our missions. And we have spent the last, how many years? Gleaning from the records the people who are slaves here, the people of color. And
You spent decades
yeah,
in that research.
And an independent researcher started the whole thing,
Diane
Cameron. And we built on that. And now Gillie has put online what we found. So there is a database if anybody wants to access it about people of color that were here in Wethersfield over the years.
Wethersfieldhistory.org is our website, and that's where our database is located. And that's an aspect of Elizabeth George Speare's The Witch of Blackbird Pond that she does not go as much into the whole aspect that there was slavery here in Wethersfield. She alludes to it briefly, but it's not something that she goes deep into.
She just touches on it.
Yeah.
And the biggest fallacy is the back and forth between Kit and Nat, who is the son of the owner of the ship that brings her to Wethersfield, about the horses, the smell of horses in the hold. Well, those horses and what he was doing there had a very real connection to slavery. The trade with the West Indies from the northern colonies, including Connecticut, and Wethersfield was a seaport. They provisioned those slave colonies, sugar colonies, because they raised nothing but sugar, which was the cash crop for both the English Empire and the French Empire and the Dutch in the 17th and 18th centuries. And that's a big, right in the beginning, that's a big fallacy. The attitude that people who were trading with the West Indies and not bringing back slaves were free of that stigma of supporting slavery.
I just want to clarify, and this is a piece of fictional literature. I know a lot of people are familiar with this book, but what do we need to know right off the top about this fiction?
Well, first of all, that it is a work of fiction. So Speare is not trying to tell a 100% factual story about the witch trials here in Wethersfield. So a little background on her writing the novel. The Witch of Blackbird Pond, she published it after her first novel, Calico Captive. And after writing Calico Captive, Elizabeth George Speare decided that she wanted to write another novel in her hometown of Wethersfield. And she self-admittedly was not a historian. And so her research process she referred to as a greedy, indiscriminate forage through novels, genealogies, geographies, and a whole bunch of other different works. So this was never meant to be a 100% historically accurate work. It's a very good novel. but it is a work of fiction. So that's what people need to know right
Yeah.
off the bat, is that don't expect it to be 100% accurate.
And that's what we stress when they come here. It's a work of fiction. It's not history. A lot of her facts don't jibe, and enjoy it as a work of fiction. A
This is a
coming
very
of
good one.
age. Yeah, she writes a good book that way. It's a coming of age book. It's a theme of alienation and growing tolerance, both on her part and on her family's part, and maybe the town. Kit. She's the heroine of the book in most respects. But as I say, there are a lot of things in there that just are not historically correct.
And I think part of, in my personal opinion, part of the novel's strength is Kit as a heroine. I think she very much is a modern woman, not a 1600s woman. But this being a children's book, I think that's a great way to engage the kids with the history, is if you have someone who they can relate to, like Kit. It helps them to understand this world that she's going through. And I think that Elizabeth George Speare does a very good job with that.
Yes, I think most young teenagers have great recognition of what she was going through. Not that they have a family that is Puritan, or maybe in some cases at least they are. But yeah, how do you fit yourself into this world that seems a little bit alienated from where you are? And she was poster child for that, a spoiled child coming from the West Indies where it was totally different, to Wethersfield, where the Puritans were in control, Puritan mentality and beliefs. And one of the things that kind of sticks in my craw when she goes to the church and she sees the whipping post and the stocks in front of the church, and she shudders. I don't think a girl who grew up on a sugar plantation in Barbados, which had the worst abuses of slavery in the Western Hemisphere, would have even batted an eyelash at that. But she's trying to set her apart from these people who are up here. And each time she does that, she recoils at something they're doing up here. And she is definitely alienated, not only from the society at large around her, but in some members of her family, that she has chosen to run away from Barbados and join them up here. Unannounced.
Yeah, I mean, we, like Kit, are the outsiders of this world. So we are coming, just like Kit is coming to understand this world, we as the reader are also coming to understand the world. So I think Kit is a very helpful heroine in helping us as modern readers to understand this very different world from our own.
Yes, I think you're right. And it's a gradual process of her going into her own toleration and them also being tolerant of her. So it's a growth in both directions. And that's one of the strengths of the novel, I think. It isn't all one-sided. At first, it is. But you see growth after a while.
You do. And we've heard from a lot of people that they've read this with their classes. Why is The Witch of Blackbird Pond so popular with teachers? Why is it such a staple in classrooms?
I think it's largely because it does paint a good picture of that era, or it attempts to paint a good picture. And it's a way of getting people young people interested in history, because it touches on witchcraft, which was a real thing here in Wethersfield. It touches on Puritans who are here, and maybe some people will pick up some information about the Puritans, who they were. It also touches on the history of not just Wethersfield, but the Connecticut colony. When James II in England decided to amalgamate New York and the New England colonies into one big colony and sent Governor Andros here to get the charter, supposedly. He didn't need to get the charter, really. All he needed was the submission of the government, which he got. But then out of that grew that legend about the charter being hidden in the charter oak and the candles being blown out, et cetera, and so forth. And the reestablishment of government under that charter after James was chased out of England and Andros was arrested up in Massachusetts. So it's a spoonful of sugar, if you will, leading into the history. And it might lead people to study, young people, to study more about that history.
Yeah, so I think you're right that that's one of the reasons for its popularity among schools, that it's a good window into this early history. I think also people are, at least the school groups we have mentioned how they really loved the ending of the novel with the witch trial. That's a very dramatic section of the book, and that's something that appeals to both the teachers and the students. They both groups love that part of the novel.
Yeah, there's a good resolution.
Yes. Yeah, it's always the worst when you're reading a book and then you've gone so invested into it and then it has a terrible ending. Like I read The Mill on the Floss by George Eliot and I was really enjoying it, and then it has this really bad ending and it's like, oh, I feel like I just wasted so much time on this book because of the ending was not great. And so having a strong ending is, I think, very important for a novel. And The Witch of Blackbird Pond has a strong ending. I think it's part of its appeal.
And I will say that was not a trial. It was a hearing. The trials were in Hartford, and they were trying to gather enough evidence to turn it over to the authorities. So it never was really a trial. And one thing I always point out is that the social mores of the time were not, they were touched on somewhat, but there was status. And I'm never quite sure in the book just where Matthew Wood belongs in that status, because he's obviously not a rich man, but he's a selectman, which meant he was the town official. That would have been a person on some standing. Also, he refers to the Reverend Gershom Bulkeley as Gershom, and to the magistrate Samuel Talcott as Sam. They would not have done that. He would have been Mr. Bulkeley and Mr. Talcott, even with somebody of his equal status. There would not have been that chumming 20th century a mode of operating with each other. There were certain rules of conduct. And the two people I mentioned, Bulkeley and Talcott, were actually real people. And Buckley's tablestone is up in our cemetery here. He was quite an interesting character in his own right. And he was actually partially responsible for ending executions of witches in Connecticut. He said that he had not seen, because he was an expert on English law, that he had not seen a single indictment that was legally proved for witchcraft. And that he wished New England had not so much innocent blood to atone for. But he also said, if the devil were to be brought up on charges, he'd give him his day in court. Because he was very much for actual conducting English law the way it was written. And they weren't doing that in Connecticut.
It did cross my mind when we were talking about classes coming or reaching out to you. Do you hear from teachers nationally or internationally, or is it usually just Connecticut?
Usually it's mainly Connecticut. but we have had teachers from other states too. I believe we've had a couple from Texas. I could be wrong, but if I'm remembering correctly, we had a homeschool group. Well, it was a homeschool student, one kid who had read The Witch of Blackbird Pond, and he and his parents came to Connecticut for a visit. So we did
Yeah,
some Witch of
they were
Blackbird Pond activities
they
with them.
were from Texas.
Yeah, so we did have that homeschool student from Texas. And we also had a teacher on a different occasion who I think was also from Texas. And they teach The Witch of Blackbird Pond at her school. And she was here in Connecticut for a visit. So she came to us and the Dean Stevens Museum. And we took her on tours as part of her professional development. And so she was all excited to bring back what she had learned to her school.
I also had on a burying ground tour teacher from California, and she taught Witch of Blackbird Pond. So she was here, I think, on a visit again in Connecticut, getting information, which she took note, which she hoped to use when she got home. So yeah, we have a far reach than just state of Connecticut.
Yeah, mainly Connecticut, but if people from out of state come to visit and they've read the novel or their teacher teaching the novel, they may come to us to learn more so they can bring that information back to their home state.
And we've had people, again, from California who were not teachers, but had read the novel and were interested in the history of Wethersfield. So yeah, it's a draw.
Yes, puts the Wethersfield on the map tourist-wise.
How else has this novel shaped the identity of Wethersfield?
So here in Wethersfield, there is the so-called Butoff Williams house. And that house, they called it that originally because they thought a guy named David Butoff had built the house in the 1680s. And that's what they thought at the time when Elizabeth George Speare wrote the novel. And it's often been said that that house inspired the Witch of Blackbird Pond. And so how that house's history has been presented has very much been influenced by the novel. When I was in high school, I remember taking a tour there where the docents were talking about, oh, and Kit would have been in this room here doing this, and Kit would have been over here doing that. Yeah, they've changed their interpretation since then, but that's how they presented it when I was in school. So how Wethersfield history has been presented to the public has very much been shaped by the novel, The Witch of Blackbird Pond. And
Right.
how people understand Wethersfield's history is very much influenced by the novel.
Unfortunately, in some cases. As I say, they wouldn't have allowed a Quaker to stay in Connecticut. They certainly, the witches that were tried here, and in general, were not outsiders. They were part of the community. In fact, they didn't allow outsiders here. They didn't allow people to live off by themselves. In fact, there was a law here in the beginning that young men could not live by themselves because young men were trouble, you know. They had to be in a family situation, either their own family, a cousin, an aunt, an uncle, or they had to be apprenticed to somebody. People living off by themselves, no. That's the reason they had homesteads in the village and they had outlying farmlands around in the meadows. In the village, because they had to attend church. They had to be a member of the body of believers in some respect. How deeply that went, well, that varied with person to person. But outwardly, they had to conform to what was here.
Going back to the shaping of Wethersfield's identity by the novel, for many years, school kids here in town read the novel in third grade. And we had, as one of our volunteers, a woman, Mary Beth Jordan, who used to teach at Wethersfield High School. And she would have the students in her class read the novel again. And they'd say to her, "Oh, but we already read it as third graders." And she would say, "Well, you're a whole lot older now. You're going to get a whole lot more out of it." And so they would reread it, and they eventually have to, "You were right. We did get more out of it this time around." So you've had a whole generation grow up reading that novel, and it's part of infiltrated popular culture here in Wethersfield. A few years ago, we had a Witch of Blackbird Pond ball here at Wethersfield Historical Society. And part of the reason for that was because the novel is so beloved locally.
And as far as witchcraft went, there were no trials in Wethersfield after Katherine Harrison. Nobody was executed after Gershom Bulkeley's committee said there were problems with these trials. And therefore, there would have been no witch trials going on at the time the book was written.
Yes.
And she does kind of a wrinkle in time for the time frame of this also.
Yeah, that's why she has them saying, "Oh, it's been a good long while since we've had a witch trial here." Because it had been in the 1680s.
The other thing is that Blackbird Pond, which was really, I give her credit. She says they're red-winged blackbirds, which they would have been around ponds like that. That was a vernal pond, meaning it was there in the spring, but it dried up. So her putting that pond there all year round was artistic license, I guess. And the thing that the hearing swung on was little Prudence Croft, because she taught her to read and write. And therefore her mother said, "She's bewitched her. She's stupid. This child is stupid." And they were neglecting this child. And according to the law code of 1650, if any parent or master committed the barbarity of not teaching these children so much English language that they could understand the Bible and the laws, they would have been in trouble, the parents. So that swung a whole thing that just wasn't so in Connecticut law. Her parents would have taken the child away, frankly, because they did that and put him with an apprentice situation. And we have some of those contracts, and it says that they are to be taught to read, and boys are to be taught to read and write and a certain amount of arithmetic, because they were usually being trained for occupation where they would need to keep books. But yeah, it would have been the parents that were in trouble. And they were obviously neglecting her. And that was the other reason it could take a child away. The town could do that. So it makes a good story. I admit it's very dramatic. And the fact that she can read the Bible is a big revelation. And as Buckley says, well, if this is witchcraft, teaching her to read the Bible, the devil must be all mixed up, or something to that effect. Meaning it's not witchcraft. But I do say it makes a very, very dramatic ending when this small child comes in and proves that she's been learning how to read and write, and she can read the Bible.
I love the story between Kit going to visit Hannah and then Prudence going and Kit teaching Prudence. It's such a good, like, warm feeling story, that's in the middle. Something bad is going to happen in the novel.
Yeah, just by the title. It's kind of it's her safe place.
Yes.
And in this safe place, she can meet with Nat. And a little Prudence, she can do some help for her. And of course, Her aunt knows about this.
Yeah. And so getting back to her meeting with Hannah, when Elizabeth George Speare was talking about why she chose Wethersfield as the place to set her novel, one reason was that it was her hometown, but another reason was she could imagine her heroine finding a home in the meadows. And that's very much what you were describing there with her meeting with Prudence and Hannah. It becomes like a home, a real home to her.
Yeah, and it's to say it's her safe place. And she can show another side of herself, which she can't show to her family.
Yeah, so the Great Meadows is a real place in Wethersfield. So that's a place that Elizabeth George Speare was familiar with. And as I said, that's why one of the reasons why she chose to set the novel in Wethersfield.
And I think in a way it reminds her of the ocean, the grasses. And that's a very real thing, because I remember when my daughter was looking at colleges, we went to Purdue and we stopped at a gas station to get some gas. And out on the prairie, there's a very, very real sense of the light that you see over the ocean. And I was sitting there and I said, "Oh, look at that. You could almost imagine the ocean that's over the hill." And my two children looked at each other and they said, "The heat has gotten." I can relate to that, yeah. And it probably did remind her somewhat of her island home her near the ocean, which is a nice touch.
We touched on there being other witchcraft accusations in real life in Wethersfield. We've touched on Katherine Harrison a few times. What were the other witchcraft accusations? Who was accused
Well,
out of
in
Wethersfield?
1648, there was a woman, Mary Johnson, a servant, who confessed to being a witch. And I think there was something seriously wrong with that woman. If you confess in Connecticut, you were executed. So she was the first one. There was a previous one in Connecticut, in Windsor. She was the first one in Connecticut that was accused of witchcraft in 1647. Before all this happened, there was a terrible sickness that went through the Connecticut colony and Massachusetts, and a lot of people died. And it sounded something like the Spanish flu of World War I. And not only that, but leaders here in Wethersfield were killed or died off. Thomas Hooker, who was the leader of the colony, the minister in Hartford, also died. So in Puritan beliefs, when bad things were happening, God had allowed the devil loose on his people because they were sinning. And the human agent of the devil was a witch. So they started looking around for somebody that might be doing witchcraft. And the second and third that were executed in Wethersfield in 1651 were the Carringtons, the husband and wife. So it wasn't just women who were executed. Mainly it was. But there were men, as there were in Salem. And the biggest witchcraft panic in this area was one in Hartford, which involved Wethersfield and Farmington. And there were 3 people that fled Wethersfield as a result of that. James Wakely and husband and wife Palmer. All 3 of them fled to Rhode Island where they were safe. And there were, again, a husband and wife, the Greensmiths, that lived on the south side of Hartford, but both had Wethersfield connections. She had lived in Wethersfield for a time. He owned land in Wethersfield. So there was that, the south side of Hartford is very close to Wethersfield. So there was that connection. And of course, Katherine was the last person tried, Katherine Harrison. And that grew out of that panic in Hartford. And she was tried twice. First time was a hung jury. The second time she was convicted. And that's when John Winthrop Jr., the governor of Connecticut, stepped in. He tried to ameliorate these trials, and he had actually gotten, in a number of these trials, a reconciliation between the accused and the community. Well, it was no go with Katherine Harrison. The town was determined that she was a witch. And so that's when he formed that committee of clergymen, of which Bulkeley was the head, Gershom Bulkeley. And I'm sure he was probably key in the decision they made in that committee, which was it was not according to English law. And these spectral visions, that was questionable too. So the two things on which it hung was the law and the evidence. So that was the end of executions in Connecticut for witchcraft.
There's Gershom Bulkeley, and then there's Samuel Talcott, who were real historical figures that are included in the novel. There's also Governor Edmund Andros in there.
Yeah, he was real.
Did he really come to Wethersfield?
He landed, they greeted him in Wethersfield and took him on to Hartford, to the government. So he was the governor of that big colony of the Dominion of New England, appointed by James II.
Elizabeth George Speare could not resist the legend of the Charter Oak because she thought it was a great example of colonial resistance to England before the American Revolution. So she loved that story, just like I love that story.
And most historians think it was just that, a myth. That never really happened. As I said, it didn't matter whether they handed over the charter, the actual thing. They handed over the government to Andros. And the clerk in charge of keeping the notes and everything wrote finesse after his visit. I mean, it's done. It's ended.
Can you just give us a really brief version of the legend or the story of the charter?
Yes.
Oak,
So
or
there
the
are
charter?
many elements to the story, but the basic story is Edmund Andros shows up in Hartford, demands the charter, and the governor at the time stalls him. And then there are two variations of what happens in that. Either the governor falls on the table and all the lights go out, or someone opens a window and all the lights go out. But in the darkness, however it happened, the charter is taken from the table and given to Captain Joseph Wadsworth, who's waiting on his horse. And he goes and hides the charter in an oak tree and thereby protect Connecticut's charter from evil Edmund Andros.
Yes.
And depending on who's telling the story, you may get some embellishments. So one of my favorites is in one version, the Willis's daughter ties a dog around the charter oak tree named Lion to protect the charter from British.
I hadn't heard that one.
Yeah, so Lion, the great canine hero protecting the charter.
Of course, the charter oak then became an icon.
Yes.
And it was a white oak. The white oak is a tree of Connecticut.
So if you've seen the Connecticut State Quarter, our State Quarter has the charter oak on it. So if you've ever wondered what the tree is on the Connecticut State Quarter, that's the charter oak. So long after these events may or may not have happened, after the Revolution, people remember that, oh, we stood up to the British. We hid our charter. We did not give it to them. It's been like a myth in Connecticut history that has made people feel good about Connecticut.
Yeah, and when the tree came down in the 19th century, there were all kinds of artifacts that were made from that.
What was it that Mark Twain said about the
If
charter oak?
if they put all the things that were made from the charter, supposedly made from the charter oak, it would circle the equator several times. So that was his take on. on the Charter Oak.
Yeah, there are so many
Artifacts.
things that are supposedly made of wood for the Charter Oak. It's a bit like the True Cross here in Connecticut. You have a fragment of the True Cross, or you have a fragment of the Charter Oak.
Yeah, we've seen a chair made out of the
Yes.
Charter
Yeah.
Oak.
And at the state capitol too,
Yeah,
they,
the state
the,
capitol.
yeah, the lieutenant governor
It
sits
says
in
in
it.
there.
That's supposed
Yeah.
to be made from the Charter Oak tree. At the last time I took a Capitol tour, they say, "Oh, the lieutenant governor sits in the chair, and it's a wishing chair, wishing that they were governor."
I think Samuel Cole also had a cradle made out of the wood from the Charter Oak. So it was definitely an icon of Connecticut history.
Yes.
Whether it was true story or not is up for grabs. But it made people feel better about giving up their authority over their own destiny for a time. They didn't really do that. And as they say, with the glorious revolution in England, where they chased James out, they had the wisdom not to execute him as they had done his father. They just chased him back to Europe. That ended. That great dominion of New England fell apart. And Andros, as they said, was arrested and shipped back to England.
When we opened today, you told us how important the full story of history is. Is there anything else you want to tell us about the programming around that for visitors, what they can expect to experience?
Actually, next week, we have a new exhibit called Forgotten Patriots. And this exhibit will share the stories of Black people, women, and Native Americans who participated in the American Revolution. So America 250 is coming up, and we wanted to share these stories that are so often ignored. And we were very lucky to get a museum makeover grant from Connecticut Humanities and Conservation Connection, which made it possible for us to put together this exhibit.
And I think our mission has been for some time to get this history in front of people because it's been ignored. In many cases, you don't even know for sure who the soldiers were. And even David White's book on Black soldiers in the Revolution does not cover the whole story for Wethersfield. So it's been extremely important to us to get this history back where it belongs.
To share the stories that we do know.
Right. And there's a lot of markers up in that burial ground for soldiers dating back to the colonial wars. King William's War, Queen Anne's War. Today, people don't even know what those are. But there's nothing up there to mark. There are at least 3 veterans of the Revolution, Black people, who are buried up there in that burial ground. Nothing. And we hope to get a marker there that says something about that.
Yes, we're hoping the town will partner with us to do that.
That's wonderful.
We also are happy to answer people's questions that they phone in or email to us. Today, Martha got an email from a lady who is a descendant of Sawney Anderson, a Black man who worked here in Wethersfield for a while and lived in Glastonbury. We're going to help that descendant find out more information about her ancestor. And we've done that for other people as well.
This is really encouraging that we're starting to get these queries because it's usually it's the white people that want to know about their families. But I think there is a movement within the Black communities to find out their history through genealogy. And sometimes that's the only way they can find it, especially in the South. So, yeah, there's a real concrete attempt on many Black organizations to find out the history, the individual history of people, just like the old Wethersfield ancestry of that guy who came from Europe, and he may have been gentry. And, well, the fact that he took a job as a cowherd says to me that he wasn't gentry. But yeah, there is a perception.
And what's great that Martha has said before is like when we're helping other people learn about their ancestors, sometimes we learn too. So we
Yes.
had a gentleman who was related to Benjamin Lattimore, a Black Revolutionary War soldier. And Martha was corresponding with him for years, sharing the information that we had here. And then he would write back to us with information that he had. And we learned so much about Benjamin
Man.
Lattimore thanks to him.
Actually, the sticking point was his name was not really Benjamin.
Benoni.
It was Benoni, but he was called Ben. Therefore, he was Benjamin. Yeah. So once we learned that, the whole field opened up. We found the records.
Yeah, because
So-
here in Wethersfield, that's what they called him, Benoni. But later on in New York, he was called Benjamin.
I'm sure because he was Ben, probably a black Ben. But yeah, and that is one of the sticking points for researching Black history. It's the names.
Well, it's
some-
a sticking point for researching any history. I
Yes,
would
but
say.
especially
Yeah.
for Black people. Because many cases, they don't even mention what their names were. The death records say Negro servant of whoever. Do they say what his name is? No. And you have to read between the lines kind of when you're coming to names. Now you say, well, could that possibly have been a slave name? Somebody's name Prince Freeman. That says to me right away, he was a slave at one time. So you have to be cognizant of the way they named people, their slaves, and what the name became when they got their freedom. And sometimes it changed. Many of them adopted the name Freeman because they didn't want to be the name of their master. And there are very few cases where the name actually reflected African history, African ancestry. So that can be a problem.
Yeah, names change over.
And
Yeah.
we're learning as we go. And hopefully, I consider a day where I don't learn something a day wasted. But I'm glad to see other descendants of slaves, Blacks in Connecticut, are starting to try to find information about their ancestors.
Yeah, that's fantastic. It's so important to share the undertold stories, the untold stories, and learn about and humanize
Right.
people who've come before us. It helps you to feel the emotions, things that they would have been through, and just to realize that that history was real. It happened to real people.
Right.
Yes. And I think that's something the Witch of Blackbird Pond does very well. It humanizes a period that can feel very alien to modern readers. The people in the story are very human.
Yeah, it brings it down to the personal level. That's, I think, the main value of that book. Experiences of people of that time. And even though it's fiction, probably mirrors some of what was going on in these witchcraft accusations. And as Buckley said, he didn't think any of them were proven legally.
Connecticut witch trials deserve to be remembered and discussed alongside the literature it inspired.
Thank you, Wethersfield Historical Society, for your efforts to honor the heritage that enriches your community and for telling these powerful stories.
Have a great today and a beautiful tomorrow.